Welcome to Citeline's webinar today, presented by Sydney Brooks. Sydney is currently the product manager for Citeline's editorial tools, overseeing the development of the data curation environment that Citeline's team of analysts use daily. She has been with Citeline for over 8 years and previously directed the metabolic and endocrinology therapeutic area of coverage, offering clients key drug and clinical trial business intelligence. Sydney earned her PhD in cell and molecular biology from Boston University and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Joslin Diabetes Center and Harvard Medical School in Boston. Prior to joining Citeline, Sydney held positions in research and development in the areas of pulmonary therapeutics and in obesity and diabetes in both large pharmaceutical companies and with a startup biotechnology company where she was the director of cell and molecular biology and oversaw R&D initiatives with various corporate development partners. Sydney will be discussing the results of a recent analysis she performed looking at key benchmarks for clinical trial durations. The title of her presentation is Trend Reversal. Despite increasing complexity and costs, clinical trials are actually being completed faster. Thank you, Sydney, for presenting this today.
Thank you for the introduction, Chris. Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. Today, as Chris said, I'm going to talk about clinical trial timelines. And this is the agenda that we're going to look at today. I'm going to introduce why we decided to undertake the analysis that we did. I'll review the approach we take in general to obtain the data and how those data were used for this particular analysis. Then we'll look at a few examples of the data we analyzed, including different phases of development, major diseases and patient populations, and some trends in patient demand. Finally, as this will be a very top-level look at clinical trial durations, I'll wrap up with some questions that could be asked to dig deeper and to do some further analyses. In terms of challenges in clinical development of drugs, the pharma and biotech industry, like many other areas, is continually being asked to do more with less and to do it faster. The overall cost to develop drugs is quite high, and coupled to that, companies are experiencing the loss of patent exclusivity with generics competitions eating into their branded revenue streams. At the same time, the trend is for growing complexity of study protocols, and there's a goal to get more out of each trial in order to answer both scientific questions and clinical questions about the drugs that are being evaluated. And frequently, study recruitment challenges are cited as the #1 reason the trials fail to complete on time. All of this feeds into both the overall timeline for clinical trials and, of course, to the mounting cost of those trials. So today, I won't be talking about the cost of clinical development. Citeline's data are not positioned to address costs of clinical trials, but we will be looking at the timelines of clinical trials. So first, a short bit of background as to what prompted us to take a look at these trial timelines. Trial durations and enrollment times in particular are often cited as increasing. And as part of an analysis that was published in 2008 by the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development, data from 57 phase 2 and 3 trials were examined to look at the impact on clinical performance in the 4-year period from 1999 to 2002 compared to the 4-year period from 2003 to 2006. And from that study, it was reported that clinical trial cycle times were substantially longer for those protocols that were conducted in that later time period. They also saw that the average overall duration of clinical trials increased by 74%, quite significantly, and patient enrollment cycle times were increased. More recently, eClinica.com reported on the Decision Review Enrollment Optimization Report that was based on 700 trials that analyzed site-level data from 3 participating sponsors. And related to oncology trials, they found that Phase 2 cycle times for oncology patient enrollment steadily increased, while Phase 3 enrollment times increased from 2006 to 2009 before taking a drop in 2010. So we were interested in taking a look at clinical trial durations using the data related to our clinical trial milestones that we've been collecting here at Citeline for over 4 years. And our starting hypothesis was that clinical trial durations are increasing and that enrollment time is a key factor in that increase. We wanted to look at what the trends are for overall trial timelines, in other words, the length of the entire trial. And we also wanted to look at trends in terms of the duration of the enrollment period and also of the study period, or the treatment period, more aptly, especially in light of the fact that trials are getting more complex, our study or treatment periods taking longer, finding the correct patient population is often cited as a challenge, our enrollment period is taking longer. Now, the approach that we took was the following. We wanted to look at several disease areas and look at clinical trial durations in those disease areas. For the analysis, we examined completed industry-sponsored Phase 2 and Phase 3 clinical trials that were started between 1999 and 2010. Now, note that the earlier end of the date range will vary by disease, and that depends on our internal processes of when we began collecting data for a particular disease, and also how readily sometimes those data are. We looked at a variety of diseases. We looked at diseases that involve trials that have variable study periods that are based on outcome or endpoint-driven protocols, such as those that are found in oncology and cardiovascular. For example, trials that are based on patients reaching a certain outcome, like progression-free survival in oncology, or events such as the occurrence of a stroke in cardiovascular. And we looked at diseases where trials have clearly stated, defined study periods during which patients are receiving treatment. For example, in diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis, asthma, hepatitis C, and type 2 diabetes. For this analysis, we used trials with actual duration data or milestones, such as the start date, the total trial duration, the enrollment period, or the study or treatment period. We didn't include studies where we did not have a start date, and we also did not include extension studies. So what do we mean by actual data? Well, Citeline has been collecting and capturing clinical trial timing benchmark data for over 4 years in a component called Trialpredict. And Trialpredict contains these embedded data for actual trial milestones and timelines for individual trials. And these data include known start dates, known trial durations. Also included are known enrollment durations and study or treatment periods. And the numbers in parentheses are the number of trials where we have known durations for these 2 periods as of October of 2012. I also want to point out that the trial timeline data we have and that we've used in this analysis are at the level of the entire trial, as individual site-level data are rarely available in the public domain, which is where we gather our data. Now, Trialpredict grew out of our flagship Trialtrove clinical trials database, where we have global coverage of trials in over 180 diseases. And there we capture in real time elements of clinical trial such as study design, patient population information, locations, trial status, results, and other information. And all of these data are accessed from over 20,000 public domain data sources. In the next few slides, I want to quickly give an overview and a couple of examples of how we source this data. As I mentioned, we regularly mine over 20,000 public domain sources, and these sources include study postings, trial results registries, both at the level of the sponsoring company and also at the level of country trial registries. Among the many sources that we use to obtain actual trial timeline data, we focus on press releases and publications, including scientific meeting abstracts and presentations, and journal articles, those sources that are considered to be quite reliable public domain sources. And as we do this, we'll look at some examples of where we obtain the data, and in doing so, we'll see how we define the terms that I'll be using throughout the rest of the slides. So the first example here is a scientific meeting poster, which was available online and shows the enrollment period and thus the start date and actually the enrollment closure date. Here it shows that patients were enrolled from June 2007 to January 2009. So June 2007 is our start date when enrollment started, and January 2009 is our enrollment closure date, and the time between those two dates is our enrollment period. This next example is a press release that's dated September 22nd, 2008, and this press release announces the completion of enrollment of a phase 3 trial. So we would use that date as the best public source of the end of the enrollment period. The press release also provides the study or treatment period here of 12 weeks, and we would use that as our study or treatment period. One other thing to point out here, and that's indicated in the blue boxes, relates to the level of our data processing and analysis. And there's information here in this press release that states that there's a screening period of 2 weeks in this study. And this points out one of the nuances in our data analysis, where we make an assessment about whether that time will be entered into the study period or the enrollment period. And if eligibility is determined after that screening or even after a run-in, then that time is considered as part of the enrollment period. On the other hand, if patients are randomized and considered to be truly part of the study and are receiving protocol-based treatments, even as a run-in, then that's considered part of the treatment regimen and thus part of the study period. So our analysts are really trying to account for everything at the trial level. This example here is of a scientific meeting abstract, and I use this to point out the study period data for an oncology trial in particular. We consider the end of the study period to be the point at which the measurement of the primary endpoint occurs. And in event-driven trials, as here in oncology, the stated primary endpoint was the median progression-free survival, stated here. Primary endpoint was median progression-free survival. And so we would take that to be our study period at 6.7 months. This is the last example that I have, and this is an example of a published journal article that provides quite a bit of very good data, including the start date of September 2007, because patients were enrolled between September 2007 and July 2008, which is our enrollment closure date, and that duration between those two dates provides our enrollment period. We also get some site information here, and we also get the study or treatment period because the primary efficacy endpoint was measured at week 24. So to summarize that, in the last few slides, I've shown basically how we get our dates, our enrollment periods, our study or treatment periods from the public domain sources. And often our total trial durations can be determined by the sum of the enrollment period and the study period. In some cases, we don't have discrete enrollment periods or study periods, but we do have a total trial duration, which might have been disclosed publicly as that discrete total trial duration. Just another thing to point out here is that the time required for individual site setup, and also to analyze the data once it's been collected and to determine if those primary endpoints have actually been met or not is not factored into our timing. It's simply the time that the patients are on treatment. So here are the diseases that we looked at for this analysis. In oncology and in cardiovascular, we looked at diseases that have event-driven outcomes. And then below that, the rest of the diseases shown are chronic disorders that we examine where trials typically have a defined study period during which patient is on therapy. And we looked at phase 2 and phase 3 trials in each of these diseases. First, let's look at an example of the results for outcome trials. And to do that, we'll take a look at breast cancer trials in phase 2 and in phase 3. So what is shown here is the total trial duration, that is the enrollment period plus the study period, in months, and that's plotted against the start date. The start date is shown here on the horizontal axis, and the total trial duration is indicated by the blue bars here. We also show patient accrual in the red boxes along the right-hand axis. And in this top panel, we have total trial duration and accrual for breast cancer phase 2 trials. And when we take a look at the trend line in total trial duration across those start dates, and that's indicated by the blue dotted line, there's a decrease observed in total trial duration. In the bottom panel, we see the same type of graph, in this case for phase 3 trials in breast cancer. And here the downward slope of the trend line in total trial duration is even more pronounced. So what factors are involved in this downward trend? Given the citing of patient recruitment challenges and increases in study complexity and how they may impact trial lengths, we wanted to break the total trial timeline down into its component parts and look separately at the contribution of the study period and the enrollment period to these breast cancer timelines. So here we take a look at the same trials that we saw in teal versus the trial start, and that's on the left side. And the study periods are plotted in purple on the right side. And again, phase 2 is at the top, and phase 3 are shown on the bottom. So if we look at the enrollment periods for both phase 2 and phase 3 in teal in breast cancer, there's a downward trend, again, in enrollment period. For study period, we see a slight downward trend at phase 2 when the study period is, again, plotted against the start date. In phase 3, study periods actually show a very pronounced downward trend. And, why is the study period decreasing? One possibility among probably a series is that there's a trend more recently to look at progression-free survival as opposed to overall survival. So that's one thing that could be dug into more deeply, taking the same data set and looking a little bit further at it. We also wanted to look at a few diseases where trials frequently have defined time on treatment for the patients that are involved. So for this, we looked at a number of diseases, but I'm going to show rheumatoid arthritis and hepatitis C virus, and we looked both at phase 2 and phase 3 here. First, looking at rheumatoid arthritis, and again, we're looking at total trial duration in the blue bars. And again, we have phase 2 trials on the top and phase 3 on the bottom. And in RA, we also observe a downward trend for the total trial duration in both phases of these clinical trials. If we again take a look at the enrollment periods and the study periods separately, phase 2 on top, 3 on the bottom. We see a downward trend for the enrollment periods in teal at both phases. There's also a slight downward trend in the study period in phase 2 and phase 3. Phase 2. In the phase 3 graph, if we just look at, actually in both phase 2 and phase 3 study periods, you can see that these study periods fall into fairly discrete lengths of time. And if we focus on the phase 3 graph here, one thing that stands out is that you can see the study periods fall into groups ranging from 3 months to 6 months to 12 months to 24 months. And they're all grouped together here. And so what we really wanted to do was to compare apples to apples and to stratify by study period to effectively remove variations in the length of the study period from the equation and to be able to look at what was happening with the enrollment period alone at a given study period length. For one thing, it's conceivable that trials that require a shorter commitment of time may enroll faster. Do we still see a downward trend when we stratify by the length of the treatment that's required? So in these graphs, we're doing just that. We're looking at the enrollment period in sets of trials that have been stratified by the length of the study period. We looked at trials with study periods of less than or equal to 4 months on the left side, and in the middle, we looked at trials that have a study period of 6 to 7 months, and on the right-hand side, trials with a study period of 9 to 12 months. And yes, we see a downward trend in enrollment period for each of these study period timeframes. Now, we also looked at HCV. And again, phase 2 is at the top and phase 3 is at the bottom. And the trend here, again, in total trial duration, is also a downward trend in that duration for both phase 2 and phase 3 trials. This should look quite familiar by now. And again, we've separated out the enrollment periods and the study periods for these trials. And at both phase 2 and phase 3, the enrollment periods on the left side show a pronounced downward trend. Perhaps not surprisingly, the study period at phase 3 is essentially constant, likely reflecting guidance for trials of a required duration at this later phase of development. For phase 2, there is a slight downward trend in study period as well in trials that were started in more recent years. So we've looked now at a couple of examples of examining the study period and the enrollment period separately. And I just wanted to now switch back and take a look at one example where we looked at different patient populations and the impact on trial durations. And to do that, we're going to look at patient population stratification in breast cancer. So this is going back to the breast cancer phase 3 trials that we looked at earlier. And in this case, we looked at the trials based on the patient population. And we looked at trials on the left side here where patients are receiving first-line therapy. And then on the right side, we looked at trials that involve patients on second-line therapy or greater, and that includes relapsed patients or refractory patients. And we see downward trends in total trial duration in both sets of these patients. We also see a trend toward an increase in patient accrual, as indicated by the red dotted trend line here, and in particular for first-line patients who are likely more difficult to find and to recruit. This pronounced increase in patient accrual wasn't revealed in the analysis when we looked at all of the breast cancer trials together, but can be seen here when we break it out according to patient population. And again, we looked at enrollment periods in teal and study periods in purple, this time on the same chart, and we see downward trends for both enrollment and study periods in trials that involve both first-line patients and those trials that focus on second-line or greater patients. So a similar analysis was performed for phase 2 and phase 3 trials in all of these diseases and in all of these stratifications that are shown in this table. And it's a lot of data, and we were fairly surprised at the outcome in that most diseases where we analyze this, the trend is downward in contrast to some earlier reports. So this, again, is a busy slide, and I talked in a little more detail about the diseases that are indicated here by the red boxes. And it is a lot to take in, but what I want to point out is the preponderance of downward pointing arrows. Some of those downward trends were more obvious than others. However, overall, our benchmark set of data did reveal a overall downward trend. And as we continue to gather more data over time, we'll repeat this analysis next year, the following year, and continue to take a look at trends to see where they're going. So in summary, so far, the years and the diseases that we examined, downward trending trial timelines predominated. These downward trends were observed for both phase 2 and phase 3 trials. And event-driven outcome trials showed a downward trending timeline for both study period and for enrollment period. In disease areas that have trials with defined study periods per the treatment protocol, enrollment periods were also trending downward. Now, we also wanted to analyze the data by looking at 4-year blocks of time. If you remember, the TUF study I mentioned earlier, and that's frequently cited, looked at 2 4-year time periods. So I wanted to use those same time periods with our data, and the data were analyzed in the following 4-year time blocks, from 1999 to 2002, 2003 to 2006, and then adding on to that the more recent time period, 2007 to 2010. And in addition to looking at trial duration, benchmarks of total trial time, enrollment period time, and study period time, we also wanted to look at some other benchmark metrics, including patient accrual, the number of study sites, and also the number of countries involved in the trials within these diseases. So using, going back to hepatitis C, phase 3 trials as an example here, we looked at the average of completed trials within these 3 periods. And in this graph here, we have total trial duration in the blue bar, enrollment period again in teal, and study period again in purple. And the total trial duration and the enrollment period and the study period, all 3, remain essentially the same when comparing the first and second 4-year time periods, 99 to 2002 compared to 2003, 2006. Now, when we compare the middle time period to the more recent time period, there's a large decrease in both the total trial duration in blue and also in the enrollment period in teal. As we noted earlier, the study period remains constant. Now, in the second graph, we again show the enrollment period in teal, and you can see the decrease in the most recent time period. There's also a modest decrease in the overall patient accrual indicated by the red line, and there's a large decrease in the number of patients per site in black. Now, while the patients per site was decreasing, if we take a look at the final graph, there was also a notable increase in the number of sites, and that's indicated by the light blue line. Again, we're focusing on the second and third time periods. So the number of patients per site decreases, but the number of sites increase, and also the number of countries indicated by the blue bars also increases. Both of these increases are in parallel with the decrease in enrollment period, perhaps strategically trying to reduce that enrollment period and perhaps also aiming to target the appropriate patient population. Another thing to consider for reducing the enrollment period, specifically for HCV, may reflect the availability of drugs with newer mechanisms and thus with greater potential for efficacy and tolerability as treatment options compared to the previous interferon, which was standard of care until that point. In fact, there are examples of the newer antiviral drugs that have come around in the last 5 to 10 years, and they include the recently approved protease inhibitors, boceprevir and telaprevir, both of which entered phase 3 in 2008, which is in this last 4-year time period. So this is a numerical summary of the pictorial one we saw on the last slide, and looking at the difference between the second time period and the most recent time period, we see a 33% decrease in the total trial duration in Hep C. At the same time, we see a 55% decrease in the enrollment period. In parallel with the decrease in enrollment, there's a 16% decrease in patient accrual, a 57% decrease in the number of patients per site, but at the same time, there's a near doubling of the number of sites. So there's a dramatic increase in the site volume and also in the geographic breadth, because there's a 163% in the number of countries where these trials can be found. So a similar analysis was done for all of the disease that we listed before, and I'm showing only a few here. These are all phase 3 trials that we looked at, and shown here are breast cancer phase 3, rheumatoid arthritis phase 3, and type 2 diabetes phase 3. And all of them show a decline in total trial duration in the blue bars, and also in enrollment period durations in the teal bars. The study period also decreases in breast cancer and in type 2 diabetes. Similar to what I showed for HCV, I also looked at the number of study sites and the geographic reach, or the number of countries that were involved in these trials. And again, there's a lot to take in here, but what really emerged here as obvious was that there are different pictures or stories for the different diseases. And this could relate to a variety of factors depending on the disease, including but not limited to the need to find drug-naive patients or certain other patient populations. It could be following the epidemiology of the disease, etc. So if we just walk through this a little bit, there were, again, different patterns for these metrics based on the diseases we looked at. If we start with breast cancer on the left side, from the first to the second time period, the number of sites in the blue line increases while the number of countries stays flat. Whereas moving from the second time period to the third time period, the number of sites remains flat and the number of countries increases. Looking at rheumatoid arthritis in the middle, there's a different picture. And in that case, both the number of sites and the number of countries run in parallel, and they show just a slight decrease across the time periods progressively. And on the final graph on the right-hand side for type 2 diabetes, yet another picture emerges, and that is that the number of sites shows a modest increase and a modest decrease across the 4-year time periods, and the number of countries progressively increases over those time periods. So as I mentioned before, this similar 4-year analysis was done for all the diseases listed, and it really produces quite a vast amount of data. But if we look at this very simply at the number of diseases that show decreasing trends in these 3 timeline metrics, that's what's shown here. So we're comparing the middle 4-year time period to the most recent 4-year time period. And what emerges from this time period analysis with regard to durations is really quite similar to what emerged earlier from the analysis of the continuous data across the start dates. And that is that there was a preponderance of decreasing trial trends in trial durations. And if you look at the number of diseases out of the total examined, well over 50%, really closer to 75% of the diseases show a decreasing trend in each of these 3 trial metrics: total trial duration, enrollment period, and study period. So to summarize, the current analysis used publicly reported trial-level data of clinical trial milestones to examine completed industry-sponsored Phase 2 and Phase 3 trials that were started from 1999 to 2010. And a couple analyses were performed. One was performed using continuous data sets, and the other using data averaging 4-year time periods, and we looked at a number of chronic diseases and evaluated both event-driven outcome trials as well as trials with defined study or treatment periods. And the data show an overall trend toward decreases in clinical trial durations in both the total trial durations and in enrollment periods. So our data would suggest that the increases in trial timelines, which we didn't see, are not driving costs up. So what might be driving costs up for clinical development? Sightline data can't address clinical trial costs, but here are some thoughts that we can offer. Potentially increasing geographic breadth, we saw some of that. It leads to increased costs to open and maintain, monitor, and communicate with more study sites in new locations. Entering those new locations, especially in a new country where one hasn't worked before, requires time and investment in navigating the cultural environment, the regulatory environment there. Also increasing study complexity. Studies are known to be more complex. There's more study endpoints that are aimed to address both clinical safety and efficacy questions as well as scientific and mechanistic questions and target validation questions. So overall, there's more samples to take and to test and analyze, and that results in overall more data that needs to be analyzed. Another potential source for increased costs are protocol amendments. Change orders to protocols results in higher costs, and particularly if those changes come at later points in the trial or in the clinical development path. All of those things, and probably more, can add to the cost of running a trial. So the data I've shown is really very top-level data. And on these last 2 slides, I just wanted to suggest that this current analysis can provide an intriguing jumping-off point for a variety of deeper analyses that could be directed at a whole range of questions, and just a few of those are shown here. Is the duration of pivotal trials in your favorite disease changing? What is the impact of adaptive trial design? As we're starting to see completion of trials that employ adaptive trial designs, do we see any effects on the trial timelines in terms of applying those adaptive methodologies to the trial protocols? What is the impact of recruiting specific patient populations in terms of various ethnic groups or specific age requirements, patients with certain comorbidities, patients who are drug naive or treatment resistant, for example? biomarkers. What trends are evolving with regard to employing pharmacogenetic, pharmacogenomic, and other types of biomarkers into study protocols? What trends are related to geography and study sites? We took a top-level peek into that for HCV and also for other diseases shown earlier. You can look at particular patient population targeting, for example, drug naive. Is the geographic breadth of studies changing? The present analysis didn't restrict to U.S. trials as the previous TUF study did, and already we have some evidence for some intriguing avenues to pursue to further tease apart geographic trends. For those of you who are interested, I can take this opportunity to point out a separate study that was recently published by my colleague Tracy DiGregorio, who looked at movement of clinical trials to low-resource countries, and that study shed some light on some of the aspects of geographic trends in industry-sponsored oncology trials that were initiated between 2004 and 2010. We can also look at the drugs involved in the companies that are developing them. So what are the trial duration trends related to drugs that are involved in particular trials? We can look at drug delivery methodologies, looking at small molecule oral drugs versus injectable drugs, look at the timelines of trials involving biologics. One can also look at particular drug mechanisms within a disease or across a variety of diseases of interest. I can also point out another example here of targeted drug therapies, which are mentioned earlier in this presentation, briefly only. A recent analysis by Christine Blazinski that was recently published in Script looks at targeted therapies in oncology as part of her larger analysis, specifically examining 2 prevalent cancers and trial duration trends seen in those disease areas. And finally, what companies are most effective at driving trials forward? Which companies have had the most success at running quicker, more efficient clinical trials? There are key pieces of competitive intelligence potential to be had in this area. Further analysis of these data sets is currently ongoing, and some of these questions are currently under examination and will be explored in the future. And in conclusion, I'd like to thank you very much for attending this webinar. We hope that you found the information here of interest, and if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out and contact us at the email address shown here. Again, thank you.